sweet. Whoa, I'm out of here.
Change the system.
Welcome back to Growing Up Gaming. It's time to talk about the Nintendo 64. And I've not been looking forward to doing this episode because I don't want to come off as too negative. But looking back on the time that the N64 came out, and really the mid-90s, speaking as someone who was like a lapsed Nintendo fan at that point, I went from the NES to the Genesis. I just found Nintendo really frustrating through the mid-90s. Beginning with the fact that they just didn't seem to want to commit to moving to CD-ROM. And I want to be clear, that's not to do with them deciding to go with cartridge for their, I don't know what generation we were in, but that generation of console, when the PlayStation and the Saturn were out there, and we'd already had the 3DO and the TurboGrafx CD and the Sega CD and everything. I mean, I was frustrated because I was so completely all in on CD-ROM entertainment, multimedia stuff, but it was because Nintendo kept waffling all through the 90s, where they kept announcing partnerships and then reneging on those partnerships with Philips and with Sony, and that's been all well documented, obviously. You know, that's why we have Nintendo games on the CDI, that's why we have the PlayStation. That's fine. But I was frustrated as a fan when they were doing that sort of thing. And it kind of felt like it continued with the N64. And what I'm talking about is not necessarily the medium, it's that if you were around in the mid-90s, they announced the N64 or the Ultra 64 or Project Reality, one of its many names, really early. They announced a partnership with Silicon Graphics really early, and they kept promising that the thing was almost there, that it was on its way. It was coming soon, it was coming soon, it was coming soon. And it just didn't show up. And yeah, it was really frustrating. And so I was kind of over it. Because at that point I had a Saturn, and I think I'd bought a PlayStation before the N64 came out. So I was still following it because I was following all gaming news back then. But Nintendo, anytime I was reading anything about Nintendo, I just sort of had to roll my eyes. So it was frustrating. It was a frustrating time to be a Nintendo fan, I felt. And I wasn't even really much of a Nintendo fan anymore at that point. But anyway, all that is to say that the news cycle for the Ultra 64 / Project Reality / N64 seemed to go on forever, and it really felt like the tactics were to keep you from using other manufacturers' consoles. That was one of the things with the Super Nintendo CD-ROM, was to draw attention away from the Sega CD, and that was one of the things with the N64 news cycle. Because they were so late, they were releasing so late compared to the competition, it was to keep you from going and buying a Saturn or a PlayStation, to the point where I believe they actually ran ads talking about how, the N64 was going to be worth the wait. I can't imagine that that did their brand any good. But anyway, I remember following that. I remember going to the arcade and seeing Killer Instinct and Cruis'n USA branded as Ultra 64, and kind of being led to believe that what we were seeing in the arcade is what the N64 was going to be, which of course it wasn't. It was a different chipset, but they were branded Ultra 64. I remember the Dream Team, and I think I have their names here. The Dream Team always made me kind of laugh because it was filled with a bunch of companies that I don't know. They didn't get me excited. Now that I'm saying, there we go. Yeah, the Dream Team. They kept announcing these companies as the Dream Team, which was Rare and Williams, which was great. Acclaim, whatever. Paradigm, Spectrum Holobyte, DMA Design, which at the time I didn't think was super impressive, but of course DMA Design went on to become Rockstar and create Grand Theft Auto, and they did have Lemmings and stuff like that too. Angel Studios, Ocean, Time Warner Interactive, who I only really knew for making really terrible games on the Saturn, and Mindscape. And I just remember being so underwhelmed by that as well. And then on top of everything else, they released... I vividly remember the first time I saw a picture of that goofy-ass 3-prong controller and thinking, like, what is Nintendo doing? Like, they've really gone off the deep end here. It looked ridiculous. And I remember the friend who sent me that picture, because this was sort of pre-internet days or very early internet days. So you weren't getting video of all these announcements. And I think this particular controller was shown at the Shoshinkai show at one point in Tokyo. I think it was in Tokyo. And my friend who sent me the picture being like, oh my god, this is revolutionary. This is going to change everything. And me looking at it and thinking like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. So all that is to say, I was very cynical about Nintendo at the time and was not super looking forward to the system. And then a rental place in the city happened to get a Nintendo 64 when it came out in Japan. This was back when systems came out in Japan a lot earlier than they did in the United States and Canada. And they had, I think it was Wave Race and Pilot Wings and Mario 64, which you see on the screen behind me here. And of course I had to rent it. My friends and I had to rent it, even though, like I said, I was very cynical about the N64 at that point. Wasn't super excited about it. And we took it home and we hooked it up, and the first thing we plugged in was Mario, of course. And that big Mario head popped on the screen, and it looked amazing. Like, I wasn't prepared for how impressed I was with Mario's head in Super Mario 64. Oh my god, it was incredible. And so we started playing it, and what can I say? Like, Mario 64 to this day is an all-time classic. I was so impressed with how Nintendo had managed to maintain the feel of a 2D Mario game, but in full 3D. Like, wow. Like, of course, you know, and the controller started to make sense. The analog controls were a revelation at that point. That wasn't something that we really had. I think Sega and Sony were starting to do the same thing, but either way, nothing had come close. Like, we had 3D action games, obviously, on the PlayStation and Saturn, and of course the one that really stands out to me is Tomb Raider, which I absolutely loved. But Tomb Raider had 10 controls, and it wasn't analog, it was digital. And I thought it played great, but Mario 64 was just a whole other thing. It was incredible. And I remember renting it and absolutely loving it, and then also playing Wave Race. And to this day as well, playing Wave Race, like if you turn on Wave Race, the water, I don't want to say the physics are great, because they probably aren't. But the water looks incredible, and it reacts really well, and you feel like you're on water. You don't feel like you're on a flat surface and just sort of leaving a wake. Like, the waves matter, and they change the momentum of the jet skis and everything like that, and you can jump off them, you can dive under the water, and it was just like, I still like playing Wave Race 64 today, in 2025, because it still just looks fantastic. But anyway, so the place that we rented the system from originally was a place called Quimpool Games here in Halifax. Actually, I think it might have been called Game World by then. And I ended up, when the N64 was released in North America, I was actually the manager of Game World in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, which was it was the second store that the owner had opened, and I had gone over there to manage it. And Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, if you look on a map, it's a little province, tiny, it's about that big in real life, and Charlottetown's on one side of the island. It's the capital of the island, of the province. And I remember when the N64 came out in North America, we didn't have the buying power to get one. I don't remember if they were hard to get in general, but we couldn't get them. Although we had our Japanese rental units, and I had taken that thing home, and I had played through Mario 64. I loved that game. I played it top to bottom. I played it so much. And so the N64 came out in North America. Me and the guy that I worked with, his name was Mike, not CJ's best friend, Mike, if you're a Player One podcast listener, both wanted one. We couldn't order them into the store. Couldn't find them anywhere in Charlottetown. We found, I think it was Kmart. Kmart on the other end of the island in Summerside. And we were both working that day, and I actually believe there was a snowstorm that day, if I remember correctly. And so, but I was the manager, and I made a management decision to send Mike to Kmart in Summerside, which was, I think, 2 hours away, maybe an hour and a half. I don't remember exactly. It was a long way, and it was in a snowstorm. To pick up a system and the games for the store, and to pick up his system and my personal system with Mario 64. And he did. He drove across the island and picked that up, brought them back, and so I went home that night and I started playing through Mario 64 all over again. And it's still one of my favorite games. It's so great. It holds up so well. I think it's an amazing microcosm of... Not microcosm. It's very exemplary of the N64 in that by the end of the N64's lifespan, Mario 64 was still probably the best game on the system, if not like one of the top 3 games on the system, in my opinion. They peaked so early with Mario 64, and sadly I feel like the system struggled to come anywhere near those heights after day one. Like I said, Wave Race 64 was great as well. I never really played Pilot Wings. I wasn't a Pilot Wings guy on the Super Nintendo either. But yeah, boy, Mario 64, it's still so playable. Obviously, Nintendo's come a long way with 3D Mario games, but it holds up. It really holds up. So, of course, those came out in, like, November of 96. In December of 96, and I've mentioned this on a previous episode, I was working in Moncton, New Brunswick for the same guy. He'd opened another store, and I had gone there over the Christmas holiday to watch the store while he went home to spend time with his family. And that was when Star Wars Shadows of the Empire came out. And I remember going to Toys R Us and seeing Star Wars being played, Shadows of the Empire on a demo kiosk. Again, we didn't have it in the store at that point, but we did eventually get it, and I think I actually ended up playing it on my N64 that December while I was living in Moncton for like I think it was 3 weeks. I was there 2 weeks maybe. And going back now, it's not super impressive, but again, the game starts with a bang. You're playing that whole Hoth level where you're flying the snowspeeder and you're flying around the legs of the ATSTs or the AT-ATs. Sorry, the ATSTs are the smaller ones. The AT-AT walkers and making them trip over. Like, it's kind of hard to describe how cool that was because, again, as a console gamer, I wasn't used to 3D Star Wars games. We also weren't inundated with Star Wars back then like we are now. Like now, every time you turn around, there's new Star Wars media, whether it's a game, whether it's a streaming show, whether it's a movie or whatever. But back then we weren't. This was before the prequels. So anything Star Wars was new and exciting. To me, anyway, to an older Star Wars fan. Older, I was 20. So I remember loving Shadows of the Empire at the time, but yeah, looking back on it now, it doesn't play all that great. But boy, was it exciting to, again, especially just play that Hoth level. Honestly, I couldn't even tell you what happens in the rest of that game. I know there's a lot of third-person shooting. That's it. That's all I remember. And I think you're doing some turret battles in space at different times. But yeah, that Hoth battle, man, what a showpiece for the system. Like, again, I keep saying it, but it's true. The N64 launched with some incredible showpieces, and I mean, they don't hold up. They don't all necessarily hold up as much anymore. 97. I'm moving through here real quick because I just have a list of games here that came out by year and the games that really stood out to me. So back in Charlottetown, again, working at that store in Charlottetown, one of the things that you would get a lot in those stores, those rental places, was regulars, especially kids, coming in and just hanging out. And I was one of those kids when I was younger. You get like some teenagers especially coming in and hanging out. And you kind of get to know a lot of them. Some of them are really cool, some of them you don't want around, but we had a small but dedicated contingent of kids that would come in and hang out. Like, say, like a whole Sunday. They'd just be there for a few hours. Their parents would drop them off. They weren't little kids, so we didn't have to, like, watch them. because we weren't babysitters, obviously. They were in their teens. They were self-sufficient. They could, feed themselves and call their parents and all that fun stuff. But they would hang out with us and just chat video games, which was cool. I enjoyed that. That was part of the job that I really liked. And obviously, we would any newer game or any game that we kind of loved, we would put on and we'd let them play the demo units unless someone was going to pay to play the demo units. And that was the was it summer? That was the winter. Sorry, early '97 was the winter that Mario Kart 64 came out. And so the other thing about the N64 that was super important was it had 4 controller ports. I think it was the first home console that was shipped standard with 4 controller ports, which was a big selling point for the N64 back then, and back when couch co-op was still a major thing. It feels like it's making a comeback, which is great, but we didn't have online play. So Mario Kart 64, I was a big Mario Kart fan. I liked Mario Kart 64. I didn't love it. Single player, it was okay. But multiplayer, we would hook it up, me and the other guy that worked there, and then a couple of the kids, or even if there were more than either way, we'd have 4 players. And we would have all day Mario Kart 64 tournaments. And it's some of the most fun co-op, most fun multiplayer gaming I've ever done. You learned all the little tricks and foibles of each little track, and I remember distinctly the Wario Stadium level where the track would cross over itself, so you would eventually have to jump the track. You'd come back. It was like figure 8, and there was a big jump over the track, and of course you could see everybody's screen. So if you got a little thunderbolt power up which shrunk everybody else, you'd be watching other people's screens, and you'd wait to see whether they were on that jump, and then you'd hit them with that, and they drop straight down and lose half a lap. It was great. It was such a good time. And we would play. We were right next to a McDonald's, and we would play tournaments every Sunday, and whoever lost would have to go buy the winner a McFlurry. I ate a lot of McFlurries in the winter of '97. I don't think I've worked them all off yet either. But yeah, so again, a game that I felt was decent single player, but multiplayer, man, did it shine. And I think that's also the story of the N64, and it was engineered that way. I mean, that's the whole reason there were 4 controller ports. The whole idea was that you wanted to play everything multiplayer. So that definitely worked. Anyway, yeah, it definitely worked for me with Mario Kart 64. Postscript to Mario Kart 64. So years later, after I'd moved to EGM, after we'd relocated from the Chicagoland area to San Francisco, I was living with Shane. I was rooming with Shane Bettenhausen, and when Greg Ford was hired as a copy editor, he needed a place to live, and we had a 3-bedroom place, so he ended up being our roommate as well. So Shane and Greg and I were rooming there for about a year. And I remember at one point we decided, because all my gear was hooked up in the front room, including my N64, because the N64 wasn't all that far removed from being a viable system at that time, and I just like to have all my old systems hooked up. And one night we were sitting there and decided, you know what, we should play Mario Kart. We should play Mario Kart 64. I was kind of reminiscing about how I used to play these tournaments with the kids at Game World, and Shane was talking about how much he loved Mario Kart as well. And so was Greg. And so it's like, yeah, let's play some Mario Kart 64. This will be awesome. And of course, all the trash talk was happening, and we all went in there feeling really good about ourselves. So here's the thing. I knew about power sliding in Mario 64. I mean, you had to do well on the tracks and everything. But I don't know if I didn't know this existed, or I didn't know how to do it properly. But I did not know, and neither did Shane, how effective the power slide boost could be. So from the first corner in that play session with Greg Ford, Greg was really good at it. He just used that power slide and he was gone. I don't think we won a race. Greg just spanked us. And playing some of this recently to capture footage for this video, I'm still not good at that power slide. boost. But man, Greg Ford was, and yeah, he really showed us. It was so pathetic. We were so bad at that game, but we thought we were good. Another game that came out in '97 that I really love, and I don't know, I don't think a lot of people do, and I don't think a lot of people remember this game. It definitely doesn't pop up in like best of lists or anything, but the Tetris license, it was kind of a wasteland in the 90s. There were a lot of Tetrises coming out. And I mean, there was a proper Tetris or two on the N64 as well, but there was also a game that was released by a company called H2O Interactive, I believe, which was based in Canada, called Tetrisphere. And there's something about that game that I adore, and it's got nothing to do with Tetris outside of the fact that it uses some geometric shapes. But you just have a big, well, you'll see footage of it playing here, but you just have this big sphere, and there's a few different play modes, but the play mode I would always play is there was like a little robot trapped in the sphere, and then you have layers upon layers of these shapes and of just garbage blocks that you had to get rid of by, I think, matching 3 in some form, matching 3 of the same size, same shape in some form. But you could slide pieces around, and you could like dig these little craters. You can get these power-ups that will blow big holes in the garbage craters and stuff like that. And there's something about that game. Like I said, it's not amazing. It's okay. But it's very chill. It's like a very chill game to sit and play. And I'll still, again, it's another one that, I know I say this a lot, but I will still fire up my N64 and just sit and play Tetrisphere for 20 minutes. I never get anywhere. I never finish the game. But I just really liked it. I don't know. There was something about that game that really talked to me. And hey, that wasn't on Digital Eclipse's Tetris Forever. It should have been. Probably not. But yeah, Tetrisphere. Check it out. Also in 97, I remember, was Diddy Kong Racing, which I felt picked up where Mario Kart 64 kind of faltered, in that it was fully 3D, whereas Mario Kart 64, all the characters were sprites. And it's weird because looking back on it, I loved Diddy Kong Racing when it came out, but I don't have very fond memories of it now. But I remember, I think the reason that the game sticks in my memory is because it was one of the one and only times that my brother gave me a video game for Christmas. My younger brother, when he gave gifts, he usually gave me like CDs and stuff like that, but he gave me a video game that year, and it was Diddy Kong Racing, which I really liked a lot at the time. In hindsight, and now years down the road, I'm a bigger Mario Kart 64 fan than I am a Diddy Kong Racing fan, but I really did enjoy Diddy Kong Racing. And Rare did some great stuff on that system, even though I didn't think that they were they were a real dream team. But hey, you know, there was, of course, GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, which you're not going to hear a lot of in this video. So then we get into, like, 98. Sorry, I'm just checking my notes on my phone here. So 98, I think, it was a huge year for the N64. I think it really sort of came into its own that year. It was also the last year that I spent in Canada. Basically, last full year I spent in Canada before I moved down to the States and started working at the magazine. And to me, the two big releases that year were F-Zero X, which I imported. So again, the N64 was a very easy system to import for because the cartridges were the same size, the pins were the same. You just had to get rid of these. There were these two little notches inside the cartridge port that you just had to like melt away or cut off, and then Japanese cartridges would just fit right in there. And so I was a big F-Zero fan, and I know that there was more F-Zero content than just the original Super Nintendo game, but if you weren't importing or you didn't have a Satellaview, I think it was, in Japan, you'd only ever really played the original F-Zero, at least I had. So it had been since 91 since an F-Zero game had come out. So I was super excited to find out F-Zero X was coming out. And man, I have to say, I imported that. I was so happy with it. They made some really interesting decisions with F-Zero X when it came to development and when it came to the tech. And the main thing was that they went with flat shaded polygons for the vehicles, and they were really small. Everything, like, if you really look at F-Zero X, the vehicles have very little definition. They're very low poly. I think they're flat shaded. I think that's the right term. There's not a lot of texture mapping on any of the machines, but there's 30 of them. And they clearly made that decision so that the system, at this point we were starting to see that the N64 could struggle. Frame rate wise, it could really struggle. And in racing games, it really showed up a lot, especially multiplayer racing games. But F-Zero X, because of sort of the technical decisions they made, runs super smooth. I have to say it must be 60 frames per second. It's locked in. It's so fast. It's so smooth. It plays great. I think it looks fantastic. Again, it doesn't look technically superior to anything really, but it does look great. And it's got some really nice play mechanics that they added in. Like, you know, there was an element of trying to destroy other racers in F-Zero, but it feels like racing combat hadn't really been a thing back in 1990, 1991. But it really was by the time F-Zero X came out, between like Mario Kart or Twisted Metal or the Wipeout series. Like, you needed, if you had a sci-fi racer, you needed to have like a bit of a combat element to it. And so the way they did it, I really liked, because they didn't go the standard pick up weapons and shoot them or drop mines behind you or anything like that. They just used the cars as the weapons, where you could juke left or right and it would create some force that you could push other guys off, and you could actually get points for doing that, or you could blow them up. And you could also set it up so that your your vehicle would spin. It could spin in a circle and just sort of wreak havoc, which was so much fun when you get into like a big crowd, because again, there were like 30 cars in each race, and if you got into a big group of them, like a big battle pack, you could just wreak havoc if you started spinning in the middle of them. But other racers could do it too. So I mean, that was a big release for me in '98. Of course, the biggest release in '98 was Zelda, and so again, we hadn't had a Zelda since Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. I don't remember what year that came out, but I think it was pretty early on. So it's so weird to talk about that now, where it felt like we used to go years and years between major sequels for Nintendo franchises, and I mean, we still kind of do, but not as many. It doesn't feel like it takes as long as it used to. Of course, I'm getting old and the years are starting to compress, so who knows. But anyway, yeah, Ocarina of Time, oh my god, what a masterpiece. Kind of one of those things that was very similar along the lines of Mario 64, where going into it, you're thinking, how are they going to do this? We didn't have dual analog controls on things at this point for 3D games. You know, the analog control in the N64 games was fairly new still. And just, you know, the Zelda games are really, there's a lot going on in the Zelda games. So I didn't really know how it was going to work. And then to have it come out and introduce Z-targeting was brilliant. Automatic jumping, brilliant. Good use of the controller for inventory management. Again, the world seemed massive. There was so much to do. The younger Link and older Link time travel aspect of it was brilliant. We still got a gold cartridge, although it always bothered me that the cartridge was like a matte gold and not a chrome gold like the old NES Zelda games, but whatever. At least we got a gold cartridge again. And yeah, I don't. All I'm going to do is sit here and heap praise on it. I mean, Zelda 60 Ocarina of Time was like, mwah, it was great. And so played so beautifully. I mean, again, Nintendo, I don't know what it was. Nintendo games were setting standards for 3D control in a way that you weren't seeing on the Saturn and PlayStation. And I don't know why it feels so surprising, because it's Nintendo, but it did at the time. I have nothing listed for 1999. So then, after that, my memories of N64 are very much centered around covering games for Expert Gamer and for EGM, because in October of '99, I moved to Chicago and started in publishing, and the N64 was still a very viable system, of course, but it was weird because it was a weird place for Nintendo to be, because they weren't top dog anymore. the cartridge thing, while they'd sold it really well with the whole, like, no load times, which I always rolled my eyes at, but Nintendo wasn't the only company that was worried about that sort of stuff. And actually, if you go back and watch my Ridge Racer history video, you'll notice that the original Ridge Racer, Namco, was really worried about load times as well, which is why you had that initial load where you played, I think it was Galaga, and then never had another load time throughout the rest of that game. That was Nintendo's thing. And I think it cost them. I think it was a good short-term sales pitch, but as people got very used to load times on CD-ROM, I think Nintendo's staunch stance on going cartridge only really hurt them. And you can kind of see that in the performance of the system. I mean, up until that point, from the mid-80s to the late 90s, Nintendo was king. Sega gave it a real run for its money in the early 90s with the Genesis, but then they kind of preemptively withdrew from that race and kind of handed what was left to the Super Nintendo. And to be fair, the Super Nintendo was really killing it in like 94, 95 anyway. So it probably would have pulled ahead anyway, naturally. But yeah, the N64 in North America, while it was popular, especially if there was anything to do with Pokemon or GoldenEye, it was always second place behind the PlayStation. And in Japan, it was third place. It was like Nintendo, it was so weird as someone who'd really gotten into video games, even though I'd played in the 70s. You know, I was of the age that Nintendo was video games. And it was so weird to live through an era where Nintendo wasn't dominant, or even fighting for dominance. And so it feels like the N64 limped along after like 99 until the GameCube came out. Especially then the Dreamcast and everything else. It just started to fall behind. But there were a few notable games that I still want to call out. One is Paper Mario. So the Super Nintendo was really known for role-play games. If you were into role-playing games, that was the system to own. I've argued this before on this channel that I think the Genesis RPG library is not given as much credit as it should have, but if you wanted to play role-playing games, you needed a Super Nintendo. So that was kind of a thing that I think a lot of us felt was going to continue on with their next console. Of course, it didn't. The PlayStation was where you went for role-playing games. Final Fantasy went to the PlayStation. The Saturn, to a lesser degree, you went for role-playing games. There were very few role-playing games on the Super Nintendo, and Nintendo itself wasn't really known for them, although it had dabbled. I mean, there was Super Mario RPG on the Super Nintendo. There was Earthbound on the Super Nintendo, and I guess you could call Zelda games RPGs. I know some people don't, but you know, you could classify them as RPGs. So I remember being very excited when Paper Mario was announced, being very excited to try it, and I wasn't disappointed. Paper Mario on the N64, Thousand Year Door is a much better game, because I feel like with Thousand Year Door and with the later Mario RPGs like the Mario and Luigi games, the writing got a lot better, but the writing in Paper Mario was still fun, and it was so different. There was no reason for it to be paper-based, but it worked as sort of a hook. It worked, and I loved that game. And back then, Nintendo was really, really, really worried about piracy when it came to video game magazines and the press in general. And so, when you were reviewing Nintendo games, not games for N64 and Game Boy, we would get ROMs, but if it was a Nintendo game, they would do like a press tour. And so you would have, it was usually members of like the game counselors. They would send them out with these suitcases with the consoles and the games all ready together and locked into these big steel lock boxes. And that was how you got to play it. So when we were reviewing anything from Nintendo, the rep was there. They weren't necessarily, they were supposed to be in the room all the time, but they weren't necessarily always in the room. But for the most part, that wasn't terrible. For role-playing games, it was tough. Because, of course, you're talking about like a 20 or 30-hour game or more. They're not going to be there that long, right? So I remember I think, the big reviewer, which is to say I wrote the bigger review on Paper Mario. And the lady that brought the system was so nice because she agreed to stay late. We had like a media room where is normally where we play at our Nintendo games when we were reviewing them. And it wasn't weird to stay and work late at the magazines. And so we kind of got into this groove where every day she was there, I was pretty much sitting, or me and whoever else was playing those games were pretty much sitting and playing Paper Mario all through the workday and then into the night, usually till at least midnight. And she was totally cool with it. She would stick around and we would, chat while I was playing, and then I would give her a ride back to her hotel each night. And yeah, it was a really nice experience. It didn't hurt that she was a really nice lady. But I loved that game, and my affinity for it might have something to do with that experience as well. Interesting note there too is that because we were based in the Midwest, as was Game Informer, normally whenever there was a press tour through the Midwest, they would come and see both of us at the same time. Like, they would swing through the Midwest and either go to, I think it was Minneapolis first and then come to us, or go to us first and then go to Minneapolis. So a lot of the times that we played anything that for review that had a save file, we would see the save file from the Game Informer guys. And I'm here to tell you, the Paper Mario save file was not very deep. That's whatever. I mean, it might have been erased. Who knows? But I just always thought that was kind of funny. The other thing in 2001 that I think I really wanted to make sure I touched on was Conker's Bad Fur Day. So, again, Nintendo wasn't the Nintendo of old. And I think Sega has a lot to do with that. Actually, for another video I'm working on, I went back and watched Console Wars again. And they make a real point of this in Console Wars, which I think is a legit point, is that, like, Sega had kind of forced Nintendo to market differently, which is where the whole play it loud thing came from, right? So Sega came out of the gate, the Sega Scream, Sega does what Nintendo don't, constantly sort of, riding Nintendo in their marketing. And so Nintendo responded with Play It Loud, which I think really worked, because it really modernized them, really made them more exciting for teenage boys especially. And then if you look at the marketing for Sony, they very much did the same thing. If you remember the Crash Bandicoot ads, and it wasn't just for the game Crash Bandicoot, but that was kind of their mascot for a while, and you had the dude in the Crash Bandicoot suit standing outside Nintendo headquarters with a bullhorn, taunting Mario and Nintendo and stuff like that. And the thing is that even though Nintendo had moved to be a little bit more modern, be a little bit more 90s, be a little bit more like MTV generation, Sony was still eating their lunch. And so Nintendo was still sort of had this squeaky clean, for the most part, this squeaky clean reputation that they kind of tarnished a little bit on purpose with Mortal Kombat, because again, Sega took them to the cleaners when Mortal Kombat came out on the Super Nintendo and Genesis, and Nintendo did that whole, like, getting rid of, or changing the fatalities and getting rid of the blood and things like that. And then, of course, they reneged and they released Mortal Kombat 2 much more arcade perfect. So it felt like they were kind of painting themselves into a corner again, because you were starting to see more adult games on the PlayStation in particular. And I think Nintendo felt like they were kind of falling behind. And so all that leads me to Conker. Now, of course, Perfect Dark also fits in here. GoldenEye also fits in here. But Conker, again, going back to that promising something forever and ever and ever and ever, and it never comes out, Conker's Bad Fur Day was another perfect example of that. If you go back and look through old game magazines through the late 90s, you will constantly see Conker listed as a coming soon N64 game. It was from Rare, And Rare had kind of made a point of being sort of Nintendo 2.0 in that they released a lot of games that were almost as good as Nintendo games, felt like Nintendo games, but weren't Nintendo games. Like, you know, you had Banjo-Kazooie, and you had Diddy Kong Racing, and, you know, it always felt like Nintendo was the flagship, and they released the great games, and then Rare would kind of do their version of the same game. And Conker, and I forget what it was originally supposed to be called. But anyway, Conker was nothing but, looked like it was going to be nothing but a cutesy mascot platformer in the vein of Super Mario 64 from Rare. And I think that's what it was supposed to be for the longest time. And there was a companion game for the Game Boy Color, a Conker game that actually did come out, and it is that. Like, it's not Mario 64, but it's just this sort of cutesy action or adventure game starring this cute little squirrel. And even if you look at Diddy Kong Racing, Conker is in it. And he's in it as, again, this very cutesy little, like, forest friend. He's got a cutesy little voice and everything like that. Anyway, Conker just stayed, it languished. It stayed on these release lists forever and ever and ever and ever. And I'm sure there's been documented somewhere as to why this change happened. We might have even talked about it in EGM. But eventually, Rare and maybe Nintendo decided they wanted to do something different with Conker. And we got Conker's Bad Fur Day. And Conker's Bad Fur Day, I loved. And I love the Xbox remake of it, too. Because it was just a 3D platformer. And it was Rare, and I'm not a huge Rare fan overall. But it's a very British, raunchy comedy game that is pretty cringeworthy looking back on it today. But again, in the early 2000s, you have to understand how out of character it was for Nintendo and Rare to release something where the character's like cursing up a storm, and it's bloody and it's gory in places, and it's got like basically Nazi references in it, although they're called teddies, and like voluptuous, very European cartoon voluptuous women in it, and like there's a boss that's just a giant pile of poop. It's a great boss fight, actually, because it's a big, like, it comes across as an opera. The boss sings to you the whole time. It's fantastic. And I just thought it was great. It doesn't perform great. It's got bad frame rate. It doesn't control great because, again, N64 games, those 3D platformers that weren't by Nintendo didn't happen to control all that well for the most part. But it was so different. It was so weird, and I really, really enjoyed it. And again, it was Nintendo kind of taking another step, saying, you know, maybe we shouldn't just keep doing things exactly the way we've been doing them. Now, it's not like they went and this was all they did after that, but it was still interesting to see them try something different. I know I haven't touched on a lot of the big games, like I said. I haven't talked about GoldenEye. I wasn't really a big GoldenEye fan. I haven't talked about Perfect Dark, although I will call out that Perfect Dark did have a really cool feature, which was you could use two N64 controllers for dual analog control, which was awesome. I haven't talked about Star Fox, although again, Star Fox is worth pointing out because that was the game that came with the Rumble Pack, so we started to get haptic feedback on our console games, which again, I think Nintendo was first with, at least with a mainstream game like that, before Sony released the DualShock controller. I think that's right. I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure. Again, Star Fox 64, okay game, I think, but super important that haptic feedback, that haptic Rumble Pack was happening. Happening. But overall, yeah, I mean, it was easy to go through the library and pick out the games I loved because it's a very short list. There are people who love the N64. I don't blame them. The great games on N64 are great. The best games on N64 are timeless. And if you were the right age group, there were games on that system that probably really resonated with you. And you know who I'm talking to. If you're that guy or girl who was going to university and a big video game nerd when GoldenEye came out, and you were one of the people who built or bought, because they were selling these things, screen dividers so you could play deathmatch in that little 4-window setup, and you wanted to make it so that you couldn't look at each other's screens. You know who I'm talking to. You were an N64 kid, and that's cool. I totally dig it. But it wasn't for me. There were some good games on that system. There were some great games on that system. There were some timeless games on that system. It was absolutely my third choice in the late 90s. And very quickly surpassed by the Dreamcast when it came out. But I do have fond memories of it for the games that I loved. Kind of reminds me of the 32X, where it's like most of the libraries throw away, but there are a few just all-time greats in the library as well. Same with like the 3DO. The N64 sits there for me. It sits just above the 3DO. I know that's probably blasphemy, but I do have fond memories of it because I did review games for it professionally. This is, again, along with the PlayStation, it was one of those consoles that was a viable console before I entered the industry and while I was in the industry. So I did spend a lot of time playing those games. I do have some very fond memories about reviewing some of those games. But for the most part, yeah, the N64 doesn't really hold a dear place in my heart. But hey, it still shaped me in some way, which is why we're talking about it on this series. So that's going to do it for me for the N64. Thank you so much for watching this. As usual, please like, share, and subscribe, and maybe consider supporting this show on Patreon. And the most important part, again, I say this every time, but it's true, my favorite part of doing these videos is that there's always some fun discussion, some fun memories about the system and about its games in the comments section. So please, if you have some memories about the N64, or if maybe you came to the system late, we get a lot of that on here too. Mention it in the comments. Let's have a discussion. Let's talk about it. Let's reminisce. But in the meantime, stay safe, be kind to one another, and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.